Hello and welcome to Fostering Connections with the Natural World, a Biophilic Cities webinar. I'm Amanda Beck, a research associate with the Biophilic Cities project at the University of Virginia. Through this series, we will hear from practitioners and researchers who are creating healthier cities, healthier urban landscapes, and healthier people through increased connections with nature. The Biophilic Cities project started at UVA in 2011 to explore and advance nature in cities. In the fall of 2013, the Global Biophilic Cities Network was launched with partner cities spanning the globe from San Francisco, California, Wellington, New Zealand, and Singapore. This series is one way the Biophilic Cities project aims to help share knowledge about the innovative work of cities, organizations, and individuals around the world who are championing biophilic design. To see the full schedule of topics and to register for an upcoming webinar, please visit our website at www.biophilic.org/registration. Today we will hear from Megan Draheim and Stella Tarnay. Both Draheim and Tarnay are active members of the DC Environmental Network, which is a coalition of DC regional nonprofits and professionals working to restore the capital's urban environment. Stella is the Chair of Education for the historic DC Woodland Dumbarton Oaks Park and an advisor on the Sustainable Landscape Design Program at George Washington University. Megan is a visiting assistant professor at the Virginia Tech Center for Leadership in Global Sustainability and teaches urban wildlife and human-wildlife conflict courses. She has a PhD in environmental science and policy from George Mason University. Today, Tarnay and Draheim will speak for 30 minutes to be followed by questions from the audience. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Megan and Stella. Can you guys hit your talk button? We can't hear you.
Hello, this is Stella. And this is Megan. Can you hear us now?
Great, perfect. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, and also Tim for inviting us to participate in this webinar. We're very excited to be part of the Biophilic Cities Network, and we'll be sharing with you some of what's been happening in Washington, D.C. There's a growing interest and a growing community movement toward Biophilic DC, both among nonprofits and in the university sector and in local government, and we'll let you know about that and some of the initiatives we're working on. This may be a familiar picture to you. I think most people think of Washington, D.C. as a capital city, and before us we have the Jefferson Memorial on the tidal basin, one of the most popular monuments in the city, shown in its most beautiful form during the Cherry Blossom Festival. But what may not be as obvious to folks who haven't visited Washington, D.C. is that it's also a budding urban hub. It's considered one of the hippest cities in North America, according to some polls. And here you see some of the things that make it a really vibrant place to live. We've got lots of bike users. It's a public transportation city. We've got a great restaurant and public art scene. And there's also a lot of construction and development going on. So there's a lot of energy in our city, which is both an opportunity and a great burst of energy and a challenge when it comes to nature. This is one of DC's most biophilic places. If you've visited Washington, D.C., you may recognize it as Rock Creek Park, and it's really one of the joys of the city. And a recent cover of the Washington Post was titled, "Our Wild Heart, Rock Creek Park." Many people enjoy this park, and we think it's one of the reasons why, in many ways, D.C. is already a biophilic city. And one of the reasons why this is possible is that DC is really a city between two rivers, and to the north of the L'Enfant Plan that you're looking at is also the very long north-south trajectory of Rock Creek Park. But as those who don't live in the city may not know, one of the reasons why nature is so close is because we really are between the Potomac and the Anacostia rivers. And one of the things that's possible to do if you're in Washington, D.C. is to simply sit or relax along the banks of either the Anacostia or the Potomac rivers. A lot of folks go out fishing. As Megan will let you know, sometimes when you're fishing on one of the rivers, it's not always that safe to eat the fish, but it certainly is possible to enjoy the nature. And I mentioned the L'Enfant Plan for you, and one of the reasons why that's interesting is because all of those diagonals in the city create pocket parks. And one of the most wonderful pocket parks in the city is DuPont Circle. Some of you have probably visited it. And it really is kind of a meeting ground of what we think of as good urbanism, because you have water and a fountain, you have trees, you have wooden benches, and this really does attract chess players, children, musicians, artists. And you see in the lower right hand that it is simply one of those places where not only roads meet, but people meet to enjoy nature in the city.
So DC is already home to really a great abundance of wild flora and fauna. We only cover 69 square miles, but we have going on 500 species of vertebrates alone. We even have our own endemic endangered invertebrate who's listed on the endangered species list, and that's the Hayes-sprayed amphipod, which is native to Rock Creek Park. We have at least one other endemic invertebrate in Rock Creek as well, and in addition, at least 5 other animals on the ESA and the endangered species list can be found in DC. The bald eagle, the bog turtle, the Atlantic sturgeon, the short-nosed sturgeon, and the dwarf wedge mussel. We're also a migratory stopover point for many migratory birds, and a lot of those are also endangered. And we even have coyotes now in the last 10 to 15 years or so they've been here. The first official sighting of a coyote in DC was in Rock Creek Park in 2005. And we also have red and gray fox to round out our canid populations. We have a variety of habitat types to support all of this wildlife, so from hardwood forests and grasslands on the terrestrial side, to vernal pools, tidal mudflats, rivers, ponds, and other sorts of wetlands on the aquatic side. And in addition, there's a lot of rich abiotic parts of DC. So the fall line between the mid-Atlantic Piedmont and the mid-Atlantic coastal plains runs right through the city. And that explains the different topographies you see in different parts of the city. So really, much more hilly on the Piedmont side and flatter on the plains side. So we really have a lot going on in terms of biodiversity in DC. But having said that, in general, DC's natural habitats are facing a lot of challenges right now. The DC Department of Environment lists a variety of challenges, including invasive species, recreation, fragmentation, pollution, which includes dumping and contaminants, and also noise, air, and light pollution, general habitat loss, parasites and pathogens, overbrowsing, for example, by our rather abundant deer population, erosion, poaching, building roads and utilities, park facilities and operations, development, and changes in land use or ownership. So these are all threats to DC's various habitat types. And part of this is because DC is growing quite a bit. So we were, around World War II, we were home to about 800,000 people. But when I moved here 20 years ago, we were hovering right around 500,000 people. And today we're at about 650,000 people and still growing. Back in the 1968 riots, whole parts of the city were really left vacant in either buildings vacant or vacant lots. And that's really changing rapidly now, though, and it's left a lot of room for new construction to be going up right and left. And so, of course, this follows a nationwide trend where people are returning to cities and also choosing to just not leave them in the first place. And the positive side of this, as Stella mentioned, is that we have a vibrant, creative, and really enthusiastic population. But the flip side is that it's making it harder for some long-term residents to stay here just because real estate prices are continuing to increase. And that also makes green space more expensive because, again, land prices are quite high. So this, as sort of I've said, this poses both challenges and opportunities to those of us who care about nature in the city. So you can see from a couple of these photos, there are two sides of this. It's great that so many people want to get out and go see nature. So walking by the Potomac, hiking in our parks, watching the cherry blossoms, getting out on the water with a kayak or a paddleboard. But at the same time, this is actually putting stress on our natural systems as well. So as Stella mentioned, DC has two large rivers that run through it or along it. Both of these ultimately end up in the Chesapeake Bay. And the Potomac is a lot cleaner than it was a few decades ago, but it still faces a lot of challenges, as does the Anacostia, which I'll talk about in a second. So for example, we have a rather antiquated combined sewage and stormwater system in DC. So when we get heavy rains, raw sewage can actually spill out into our waterways. That's been made worse over time because of all the increased development that we're seeing in the city, and because of that increased impermeable surface that goes with that development. So there's more water runoff into the system, which makes sewage spillovers more likely. So this, of course, affects wild animals and plants, but it also has an impact on human enjoyment. So it's usually illegal to swim in the Potomac in DC, but it's permitted in special occasions, such as our triathlon, our annual triathlon. But every now and then, including last year, the swim portion of the triathlon is actually canceled because there was a recent spillover into the river. So the Anacostia River, which is pictured here, also faces threats. Although just like with the Potomac, it is a lot better off than it was a couple of decades ago, thanks in large part to efforts from NGOs like the Anacostia Watershed Society. But it still has a long way to go. So it was given an F for water quality, again, last year by the AWS, for example. Historically, pollution control and restoration efforts were higher for the Potomac than the Anacostia. The Anacostia runs alongside some of the more poorer parts of the city, but I think that has changed, and efforts are going on pretty vigorously to make the Anacostia a better place. Like most places these days, invasive species are a threat to many of our native plants. So there's 42 invasive plant species found in Rock Creek alone. Garlic mustard, autumn olive, English ivy, ground ivy, Japanese silkgrass, kudzu, all of the sort of usual suspects. And although, as Stella mentioned, we do have abundant green space in DC, much of it exists in lawn form, which is pretty much a wasteland for biodiversity. So some lawns in DC are really quite important for humans. So the National Mall is sort of the most obvious example of that. It's a very important place for people to gather for both recreational and political purposes. But we do tend to overuse lawns in our society. And many of our parks are planted out in grass, even if no one is really using that lawn space. But there are alternatives. So for example, this is a park in Chicago's Greektown, which has a lot of roles that it plays. It provides lawn space, it's a playground, there's a fountain that kids can play in the summer. It's really a great place for people to be outdoors in their neighborhood. It's a relatively small neighborhood park. But it also provides habitat for wildlife and for native plants. So there are habitat gardens that weave their way throughout much of the park. And I think this is really a great example of a green space serving two roles at once, and an idea that we need to pursue more. So there is definitely inequity when it comes to access to nature in DC, and much of that falls along socioeconomic lines. So you can see in this map that, again, we do have abundant green space in much of the city, but there is also a lack of it in other parts. And even in some of the areas where there is great green space, some residents have expressed safety concerns, and so they don't use the parks very often, if at all. And the same goes for our tree canopy. We have a strong tree canopy in some parts of the city, especially in the northwest quadrant, which is historically the wealthier part of the city, but it's still quite sparse in other parts of the city. And this is a problem for many reasons. Besides being a wasted opportunity to provide more habitat and resources for our wildlife and for our wild plants, it's really a basic environmental justice issue. The research on the link between exposure to nature and human health and well-being is really pretty extensive, and it's pretty clear that exposure to nature is very important for humans. Even if that's sort of quote-unquote just having a healthy tree canopy that can provide support for birds and for other wildlife, or a pocket park that sort of tends to the needs of both people and humans. Or, sorry, humans and non-human animals, rather. So not every neighborhood is going to be next to Rock Creek, and we certainly recognize that fact, but all of our neighborhoods can have more nature. When humans and animals interact, conflict often, not always, but very often, results. And so this can range from conflicts over wolves preying on livestock to raccoons getting into someone's attic. And it tends to only partially ultimately be the actual conflict between the animal and the human. Instead, oftentimes the animals actually stand in for larger issues. So going back to the wolf example, that's often an issue of private property rights, suspicion of the federal government, having your identity as a rancher being threatened. And I think that in many of our urban wildlife conflicts, we're seeing something that was dubbed by Annabelle Sabeloff and some others as the nature-culture divide. People who see nature from this perspective believe that nature is something that happens kind of out there in the wilderness. It has little or no place in the human-built and in human-dominated environments. You know, maybe except for a few species like songbirds, which are especially valued. And this isn't limited to city residents, of course. I think the same argument can be made that this comes into play with the wolf rancher example. But we do often see it come up in cities. And I think it's pretty tremendously damaging in many ways. Certainly to wildlife, it's damaging. If you don't believe that wildlife belongs in your neighborhood, your first reaction to conflict is going to be to remove that animal. That tends to not end very well for the animal. Coexistence is really just not going to be a viable option for you, and your tolerance for wildlife is probably going to be pretty low. So I did some research in the Denver suburbs on coyotes, and at one of my study sites, a resident actually called the police to come and shoot a coyote when the coyote was singing outside their house at night. The coyote was making too much noise for them to sleep with their windows open, and they were bothered by that. So this is bad for wildlife, but it's also bad for people. As we've just talked about, it's important for people to be around nature. It improves their health, both physically and mentally, and is just all around good for people. So if you have this low tolerance for wildlife and you don't believe that it belongs in your neighborhood, you're really going to be less likely to reap those benefits from it. So I'm a conservation biologist by profession, and I really do believe that sort of busting through this myth of the nature-culture divide is one of the most important things that people can do in my profession.
Thank you, Megan. And as we started talking about Biophilic DC and convening our working group, we started asking ourselves the question, well, we have all of these wonderful assets, and we also have challenges, so are we a biophilic city? And we think we're on the way, and some of the evidence of these projects will speak to that. And then we'll finish our presentation by talking about the legislative initiative that is probably of the greatest interest to those of you that are in the network. So if you look at the nonprofit environmental sector in particular in DC, you'll see that a lot is really going on to protect and restore the ecosystems of the city, and also to, for lack of a better word or another word, to make it more biophilic, even though these organizations may not use that word. And on the slide, you'll see that some of the things that are being done by a wonderful organization called the Anacostia Watershed Society, and they actually take people out on the Anacostia River so that everyday contact, the immediate contact when you're out in a canoe or a kayak or boat, really lets you know both about the beauty of the river and also its challenges and its pollution. And AWS, Anacostia Watershed Society, has also been doing a lot in working with citizens to plant native species, and especially wetland species along the banks of the river to absorb some of the pollutants. Also showing up the banks of the river in a variety of ways, and you see some of those shots here. Anacostia, Groundwork Anacostia has also been working on the health of the Anacostia River by engaging young people especially, and they are the managers of several litter traps that collect some of the trash that floats along the river. And this has been very energizing to the neighborhoods to see visually how the river has been improving. Like AWS, they take folks out on the river, and sometimes it's really exciting as young people especially are out on the water for the first time. And in the lower right, you see KC Trees, and this is one of our biggest champions for healthy tree canopy. KC Trees has partnered with many, many groups and is planting trees throughout the city to create a healthier and more lasting tree canopy of native trees. We have had tree cover in the city of Washington, D.C. that's been in the lower 30s for many years, which isn't bad, but we think we can get it up to 40%, and organizations like KC Trees and the city have been working on that. Next slide, please. We have a delay in our slides, which is why you're hearing this gap. Another example of what's being done in the city in the nonprofit sector is actually in Dunbar and Oaks Park, one of the projects that I've been involved with. And here you see a group of very energetic GW students, probably very happy to get away from their studies and collecting invasive species, in this case silkgrass, which has been kind of taking over that park. It's an extension of Rock Creek Park, designed by Beatrix Farrand, but really it's been run over by many species that were not intended to be there, including some of the ones that Megan told you about. But silkgrass is one of the favorites for the students to pull and have work parties on. Another picture of Casey Trees helping us put in native trees. And because it's a valley park and it's hidden from the city, even while it's in the middle of the city, it happens to be one of the places where wildlife rehabilitation folks from City Wildlife bring back animals that have been injured. So turtles and birds often get released in Dunbar and Oaks Park. Next slide, please. Here in this next slide, you see some of the work that the City of Washington, the District of Columbia is doing, and this really needs to be acknowledged as well, because much of this has been moving the city toward being more biophilic, more sustainable, and more resilient. And some of that work is coming out of the District Department of the Environment. In fact, this whole initiative is largely DDOE's work. But there was a very ambitious set of goals created for the city around things like restoring the rivers to be fishable and swimmable, waste reduction, energy reduction, and climate health, green building, and parks growth and parks management. And you can find those in the Sustainable DC document. But many of them are aspirational, and we hold our breath, like many of you in other cities do, that we'll achieve these by 2020 and 2030. But on the rivers front, really much is going on to clean up and restore the rivers and their tributaries. Also worth noting is the fact that DC is one of the country's greenest cities from the point of green buildings. We're always in the top 3, competing with Chicago and LA for the number of LEED buildings and Energy Star buildings as well. And now DC has also participated in Star Communities and is fairly high up in that new ranking system. So this is all to the good, but it really does kind of raise the question, while we are going green and we are going sustainable, how biophilic are we? Are the residents of the city benefiting from the healthier ecosystems, and are they able to really be in daily healthy contact with nature? And some of the best work along these lines that's being done is actually through partnerships between the DC public school system and probably a dozen really effective nonprofits that are working on schoolyard gardens and environmental education. And one of the important initiatives coming out of the city that a lot of nonprofits are assisting with is the Environmental Education Literacy Plan, which is now being instituted throughout the DC schools. And so it is the hope and the aspiration that DC's children, as they grow, will become much more familiar with the butterfly that is flying outside of their school, or the species, the plant species that they may find right outside of their own homes. Next slide, please. In the midst of all this, a group of us started meeting and talking about how we can make DC a truly biophilic city. And here you see our convening organization, DC Environmental Network. Now, this big crowded photograph is actually a meeting a few weeks ago in which Tommy Wells, the new director of the district's environment agency, was introducing himself to the community. But in that room, there were quite a few kind of pop-up questions and notes of interest in biophilia, along with all of the other environmental concerns. So we were really pleased to see that. DCEN has hosted a number of presentations on biophilia alone, and there you see in the upper left Megan, myself, and Tim, who drove up to DC and gave a really very nice presentation. And probably the most immediate and probably interesting initiative we can share with you, and we'll welcome your questions, is you see in the lower right, we're proudly standing in front of Councilmember Che's office, and we have just met with her policy director, and we've been talking about making biophilia and Biophilic DC part of the city's legislative agenda to really move it through the laws of the city, first through a sense of the council, and as we move forward, through other more practical initiatives. And I'll hand this over to Megan to tell you about that. And we have a delay in our slides again. Thank you for bearing with us. Okay, so we'll do the goals. Thank you. So before Megan jumps right into the legislative initiative, we do want to let you know about some of the goals our working group has set. And our group includes Megan and myself, and also Ann Lewis from City Wildlife, which is the city's first wildlife rehabilitation center. Really great place. Come to DC, visit the monuments, and visit the rehab center. It'll really impact you. And then John Havidian from the Humane Society have been great supporters, DC Environmental Network, and a growing kind of widening circle of environmental organizations that share our interest in making DC a biophilic city. So our goals as we grow them include, first, the legislative action in support of biophilia that Megan will touch on in just a moment. District membership in the Biophilic Cities Network. Individually, we're both involved, but we'd like to see the city government be an official member of the Biophilic Cities Network. We think that would be of great benefit to DC, and hopefully we'll be learning from each other around the world. And then district policies that reflect biophilic values. And we're very pleased to know that there are staff throughout 4 or 5 different agencies in the city that are very interested, actively interested, not just in sustainability, but also in biophilia. And so some of the policy goals in this area that we have is to create an understanding and value of urban biodiversity and wildlife in the city, to make sure that the city provides equal access to nature across the neighborhoods, and especially to children who are in the poor neighborhoods of the city, that we have healthy ecosystems and a healthy environment that thrives along with human beings in this place we call our home, that we have a biophilic built environment and infrastructure, not just functional low-impact development projects, for example, but ones that are beautiful and tactile enough that people will love them and remember them. And healthy neighborhoods and people throughout the city, which to us must include biophilia and contact with nature. And generally moving away from government action, that we as the residents of the city share a joy in sharing and stewarding the natural world that we're a part of. On a more organizational level, we'd like to see collaborations both in the nonprofit and the private sector. And it's worth noting that the leaders in the green building movement that DC got so much credit for in the last few years were actually private sector developers and builders. So we think it's quite possible to engage the private sector in the biophilic initiative. And also we could benefit a lot from collaborative knowledge networks because there are so many nonprofits doing great work. It would be good for us to connect and talk about how we can leverage and make the most of our efforts to make the city biophilic. And we both are associated with universities. We'd love to see more. And finally, we'd like to see more catalyst projects that could be pilot projects throughout the neighborhoods of this city to demonstrate biophilic principles.
So our first concrete goal as a working group is to get a Sense of the Council resolution passed through our city council. And we drafted this resolution that basically declares DC a biophilic city, and thanks in large part to one of our members, our steering committee members, who's Chris Weiss of the DC Environmental Network. One of our council members became interested and is going to be introducing this legislation, or this resolution rather, at an upcoming legislative meeting, which is probably going to happen in early March. So this is non-binding, but it does serve a few purposes. First, it sets the tone for future work that we'd like to do in DC, and so we think it's a really good foundation to build from. Second, it's a great way to engage the council and the city government in general about this issue and just really get that conversation started. Third, it's an important step towards DC joining the Biophilic Cities Network, which is certainly also a goal of ours.
And finally, our ultimate goal is to have a biophilic DC. And we think that really isn't owned by government or the private sector or any particular group of organizations, but by citywide, by the residents and all the people who work and live in the city. And so we're reporting to you very much in the middle of our initiative. This is from the Green Trenches report to you, and we're very much a work in process, a work in progress, and we're happy to tell you more about what we're doing as you ask us questions. But Biophilic DC is something that there's a growing interest in the community for in Washington, D.C., and we'll look forward to staying in touch with you and telling you how we grow as we grow to create a biophilic city.
I think with that, we'd love to take any questions you might have.
Great, thanks guys. If lawns are sort of dead zones, will DC be implementing policies to encourage the planting of edible lawns or biodiverse lawns that are sort of like bioswales or butterfly gardens?
In terms of actual policy and legislation, there's nothing that we know of about that's in the works at the moment, but that's certainly something that we've expressed or we've discussed as a working group and that we've been interested in pursuing.
I had trouble hearing the complete question. Was it a question about butterfly gardens, or what were the specific?
Just how DC is trying to transform like an empty landscape of just lawns that have no biodiversity to something that's more biodiverse and more natureful, such as a butterfly garden.
Thanks for repeating. So we don't know about butterflies, and we really like what we've seen in some of the other cities in the States. But there is a growing movement of beekeepers in the city, and also of gardens in DC schools, many vegetable gardens, and some of the teachers are using them as ecological laboratories. And through the District Department of the Environment, there's a lot of work being done on low-impact development, and they are trying to use, to some extent, native species. So there is work going on in different sectors, and of course we think much more could be done, and in particularly places for butterflies would be really a great thing to do.
And part of that is that, as Stella mentioned, there is a lot going on in terms of urban agriculture in DC, and the beekeepers are certainly part of that. One of the things that I think we'd like to see is for habitat for wildlife to go along with that. So, for example, native pollinators are just as, if not more important for agricultural reasons as honeybees are. So it would be great if we could work with some of the urban farms to plant habitat gardens for native pollinators and have, again, those sort of win-win situations like the park in Chicago that I spoke about a bit earlier.
How does urban agriculture fit into the initiatives going on in DC, and can either of you suggest how to get involved with those programs or organizations?
Like I just mentioned, I think that there's a lot of places where we can work together on increasing the sort of biophilic aspects of DC and also boosting habitat for our native wildlife and for native plants. I think there's a lot of natural partnerships that can really grow out of that, and DC certainly has a growing urban agricultural system.
And some of the specific organizations to get involved with might be, if you want to look up Rooting DC, that's an event that's coming up at the end of the month, and a lot of the community garden and environmental education groups meet at actually Wilson High School specifically to exchange information and seeds and other things for the coming spring planting. So Rooting DC, and also there are many community gardens throughout the District of Columbia, and I don't have a specific URL to give you, but if you look up community gardens in Washington, D.C., you'll actually find quite a lot.
And also, if you want to get in touch with us after this webinar, I think we'd be happy to try to point you in some specific directions as well.
Great, thanks. How is the Biophilic DC initiative going to help the city monitor that people are getting quality amounts of city nature? Have you guys had a chance to sort of talk about that with the group who is the Biophilic DC initiative?
So the question is about monitoring?
Yes, monitoring, but also sort of understanding the trends. How much, how many numbers, how many people, what spaces.
So Biophilic DC right now is, if I can use that word, a very organic initiative that started between a group of people in a nonprofit and academic sector who were really interested in biophilia. And we partnered with the DC Environmental Network. So right now, we're living kind of in that nonprofit space, NGO and academic space. But when this legislative piece comes through, then a lot of what makes Biophilic DC will actually be in the ownership of the city government. And part of what will be able to happen is that many of the staff in agencies such as the environmental agency and the real estate agencies within the city who would like to create biophilic change for biophilia will then have, in a sense, kind of a leadership acknowledgement that it's important. So I see that as one of the evolutions that will be taking place. And then if there are initiatives that come out of specific agencies, then they'll be under the oversight of course, the heads of each agency, and then as part of legislative oversight hearings that monitor particular agencies. So, for example, the District Department of the Environment goes for regular oversight hearings where they have to talk about the success and ongoing movement of their programs. I don't know if that answered your question. Did that get to the heart of it, or was there another aspect that you were asking?
Well, and also just to jump in there, I think the metrics that we're using to evaluate biophilic cities initiatives in general are still developing. From an academic perspective, from my background, it's certainly something that I'm interested in trying to get a better handle of, not only how many people are visiting the park, which is a relatively easy metric to design, but what value are they getting out of that experience, and how might that experience be enhanced for them. And so it's something we have talked about just a little bit with Tim and with a couple of others, and I think that as we go forward, it's certainly something that we're going to be considering more and spending more time talking about.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, Megan, can you speak about how we can better design green roofs to serve more effectively as habitat?
Sure. So one of the things that we see with green roofs is that they give all sorts of benefits, general environmental benefits. So they reduce heating and cooling costs of the building. There's stormwater retention benefits, and so on. But we often see them sort of sedum and gravel type of green roofs, which again is great for all of those other reasons, but it's sort of a lost opportunity for providing habitat for native wildlife and for native plants. And you do see some habitat. Not every building is going to be able to support that, but a lot of buildings can. And so if we see sort of a shift in mindset over what a green roof is and what the important pieces of it are, I think we can end up providing a lot more habitat for native pollinators, for some birds. There's been some research in New York City that shows that quite a few species actually use green roofs if they're designed well, including even bats. So I think that's definitely one of the things that interests me and is a way to just sort of slightly shift the framework from just the sustainability aspects of it in terms of energy conservation and all of that to also include this biodiversity component.
And as a working group, one of the first programs we've talked about is to actually have a public forum on green roofs as habitat. There are a number of people in the city who have some expertise in the area and would like to exchange ideas about how that might or might not be possible. So we can keep you posted on that. That might be a topic that's of interest.
Are there any DC-specific tax credits for developers, landowners, anyone else that encourages green infrastructure, urban agriculture, and also blue infrastructure?
There are incentives, kind of cost sharing for green roofs and for home restoration projects that deal with making river-friendly yards. Kind of a cost share, you get a certain number of dollars. per square foot or for per project. Other than that, Megan and I are sitting here looking at each other. I can tell you there's some conversation about that within a couple of the agencies. The question being, how do we preserve land for biodiversity in exchange for perhaps building in a part of the city at a greater density? But that's a very theoretical conversation right now. And if there are others, we don't know about them, but we can look it up. And if we find out, we'll share it with the group.
Stella, can you discuss how DC could give a deeper, an expression to this deeper biophilia that's happening in DC?
Yeah, I think that question is from Tim, right?
Yes, it is.
Thanks, Tim. I have to write that white paper. I know I do. But I've started to differentiate between what I call sensory biophilia and deep biophilia. And I think it might be a worthwhile distinction because sensory biophilia is something that so many people experience and enjoy. So even suburbanites who move out into the far reaches of the metropolitan area and drive for an hour and a half and use up a lot of petrol can be biophilic from a sensory point of view because they like to drive out to the greener spaces of their neighborhoods. But in my mind, deep biophilia responds to a deeper, more knowing love for the living world, where you may choose to live in a city so that life in the metropolitan area will be preserved, or you don't break that branch off a tree that you would love to smell and have in your vase, but you will let it live because you have a deeper sense of biophilia. And so it's certainly my hope that we can tap into some of this deeper biophilia here in our own city, and as we think about biophilia as a discipline, that we think about it in those terms as well. And I think we could do much more in DC beyond sort of functional ecological restoration, but to really make it accessible to people, to kind of engage them. And I suppose maybe it's a political strategy because you need to get to the deep biophilia, but you need to engage people's senses so that they will enjoy the nature to allow and support the deeper work to happen. Did that get to it, Tim, or is there some other angle on that you'd like to explore?
It's certainly a unique distinction. Well, thank you, Stella and Megan, for braving the snow you no doubt had to make it through to get to work today to present with us. Being able to look at what cities are doing to become more biophilic in the face of challenges like demographic and economic changes is really helpful when you're a citizen who wants to make your city better also. And thank you, everyone, for listening in today.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Our next webinar will be with Yvonne Lynch from the City of Melbourne, Wednesday, March 4th. It is at a different time than our usual 12:30 slot. It will be at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.